Welcome back. We begin our top stories this morning in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, which was released on Monday, titled The Urgent Need for a Climate Change Act in Zimbabwe, urges Zimbabwe to introduce a law specifically focusing on climate change to show its commitment to help mitigate the effects of climate change. ZELA alluded to government's willingness to support climate change activities. However, it pointed out that the country did not have a specific climate change act.
Well, Zimbabwe is a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Climate Agreement. And joining us this morning from Harare to speak more on the urgent need for a climate change act in Zimbabwe is Mutuso Dliwayo from Zimbabwe's Environmental Law Association, ZELA. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Morning. How are you?
We're very well. We want to start with asking how important it is for Zimbabwe to have this Climate Change Act. And is it going to change the urgency, with which the country deals with climate change issues?
Yes, it is very important, and it is going to change the way how we deal with climate change. Zimbabwe, as I've already indicated, is a signatory to a number of those conventions. And Zimbabwe itself does accept that it is being affected by climate change. And this is reflected in a number of policies that it has adopted that include the National Climate Policy, the National Climate Change Response Strategy, and also the National Determined Contributions. But what is really missing, as I indicated in that article, is basically an act. When you look at policies, these are basically a statement of intent of what the government intends to do in a given sector, and in this case, climate change issues. But unlike policies, laws actually has what we call rights, provides rights that can actually be enforced in a court of law. So a number of lawyers, a number of community-based organizations are struggling to enforce their rights simply because of the absence of this act. So to a large extent, it will help promote these rights if the Climate Change Act is enacted. Yeah, so Zimbabwe has done well by coming up with the policies, and the next logical step is actually to come up with a Climate Change Act. So we see a lot of value in that, and it also helps us as lawyers, as society organizations that are trying to enforce these rights. So that's why we are urging Zimbabwe to enact the Climate Change Act.
All right, now let's talk about what's applicable as it is. Now, you've mentioned that Zimbabwe does have policies, but that the Climate Change Act is very important. How would you say that the response of the government to the call for a Climate Change Act has been, the lawmakers? What's the progress rate of this Climate Change Act?
We seem to be getting somewhere. Recently, the Parliament of Zimbabwe, through the Speaker of Parliament, actually indicated that Zimbabwe was moving towards enactment of a Climate Change Act. But not only that, the minister responsible for environment, climate, and tourism and hospitality industry has also just sent a memo to the cabinet, which contains what are called principles of climate change bill. So we feel that the momentum is gathering, and that maybe we may be getting somewhere very soon. So the whole idea of us as society organizations, one coming out of that article, also doing a lot of advocacy, is to make sure that the momentum continues. So we see that there seems to be that appetite, there seems to be that interest, and we hope that this will result in a law. Of course, we know from previous experiences that some laws have taken years to be enacted, but we hope that it will be different with this Climate Change Act, since there seems to be consensus among the stakeholders, including the government, parliamentarians, society organizations, and the private sector, that indeed climate change is a serious issue that does not only affect development, but basically human rights as a whole. So I think we have now moved from that thinking that climate change is simply an environmental issue, but it does affect human rights, the right to development, even the realization of sustainable development goals. Zimbabwe talks about Vision 2030. All that is in jeopardy if we don't address the climate change scout. So that's why we feel that it's important, and hopefully everyone moves in the same direction, and we'll be able to have the Climate Change Act in the shortest time possible.
All right, but I want you to, help paint a picture of how climate change is affecting Zimbabwe, as a country and its people. Are there certain things that have become, worse or different, in the last few decades that Zimbabwe cannot really feel like climate change is not its own problem, because people would argue that Africa contributes very little, to the destruction of the ozone layer and whatnot. So, is Zimbabwe being affected in ways that you can see?
Indeed, it's true that Africa does contribute very little in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that contributes towards climate change. But the irony is that it is the continent that is affected most, despite contributing little. So we can't sit around and say, well, we are not responsible for that problem because we are being affected. And in Zimbabwe, it has been very evident, I think, over the past 2 decades or so. Previously, we would have maybe a drought once in every 10 years, but now it's now more frequent. As I speak, Zimbabwe is currently experiencing a drought. So we now have intervals of maybe 2 to 3 years. We have droughts. We have also had increases in terms of cyclones. I'm sure you heard about Cyclone Dai, which was very devastating in terms of its impacts and the effects. And we are still yet to recover from that. So I think for me, when you look at those cyclones, when you look at the cycles through which the droughts are occurring, it's evident that climate change is now really affecting us. So when you look at climate change, it affects, as I've said, the right to development, the right to food. We mainly depend on rain-fed agriculture, and that has been affected. So we have become food insecure as a country. Then the right to shelter itself, when those cyclones happen, those houses are destroyed. The right to health, and ultimately the right to life itself. When you look at Cyclone Idai, a lot of people actually perished as a result of that. So I think it's evident to everyone that in as much as we are not responsible, but we are feeling the effects. So
Absolutely.
we can't really stand aside and say, look, it's not our problem. We are not responsible for it. Let those that are responsible intervene.
All right.
And I think for me, that's the irony. Yeah.
All right. Let's talk very, very briefly about how people in your country are basically responding to climate action. We know that that's goal 13 of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Beyond having these policies and these acts, how are the people responding? How aware and involved are they in climate action?
Indeed, because of those impacts, people are now beginning to take action. I think I work for a society organization, and a number of other civil society organizations, both national and international, are beginning to build the resilience of these communities in terms of advising them how they can adapt to climate change, whether it is through agriculture, instead of relying on those crops that require a lot of rain. People are now advising them to begin to focus on small grains that does not require a lot of rain. So all those are ways through which communities are adapting. The government is also playing a very active role, again, advising them how they can conserve the little water that we have and making sure that the growing patterns are also becoming different. So I think those are some of the practical steps that are there that people are using to begin to adapt to climate change. And also industry itself is also playing its role, also becoming more energy efficient. You look at the mining sector, they are now coming up with policies, strategies as well that enable them to reduce their carbon emissions. So I think there is that general understanding that we all need to play a part.
Absolutely.
And we are doing our part as stakeholders.
All right. Thank you very much, Mutiso, for joining us. And we certainly wish Zimbabwe all the best as it pushes towards having this climate change act. We do certainly want to see the act coming into fruition, and more importantly, climate action being taken in Zimbabwe. Let's move over from Zimbabwe to Zambia.